Hello again, everyone. It is I, the Notorious Liar, and I have come to change my name and go back on my promises. And I'm all out of names. So, rather than making the fighting game video that I said I was going to, I am instead continuing my descent into madness by making another Lancer video. In case you haven't watched my previous Lancer video, in that one I go over some of the general lore tidbits, the core gameplay mechanics, as well as the different manufacturers and frames. In this video, I'll be laying out the game's lore in an overarching timeline that will cover the broad strokes of the settings so that you can have an idea of what's going on in general. Keep in mind this won't cover every aspect of the lore, as that video would most likely be well over 3 hours long and take just as many months to make. So, in the interest of preserving my sanity, I'll save the more specific parts of the lore for other videos down the line. But before we get into it, I'm obliged to remind you to like and subscribe, as well as to check out the links in the description. First things first, our timeline starts off in a pretty familiar place. It's your fairly standard sci-fi setting. Earth is advancing technologically, other planets are getting colonized, and the environment is in complete shambles. Starting our timeline at roughly 6,000 years before Union takes over, or 6,000 BU as it would come to be known, humanity has managed to place itself into a precarious situation. Essentially, as humanity advanced technologically, their unchecked development had the unintended side effect of spreading massive amounts of pollution through the environment. Realizing that Earth was resting on the edge of complete ecological destruction, rather than trying to salvage it or make a plan to bring back the numerous extinct species, the world leaders of Earth instead decided to construct a number of massive spaceships to send towards the habitable alien planets. The first of these colony ships was a genuinely colossal generation ship named the Apollo, because irony is only lost on the dead. Lofty metaphors notwithstanding, this American-made ship would be launched with a few thousand people and the most advanced tech humanity could produce towards the distant planet of Caracas, a name which some of you may find quite familiar, as this planet would become the origin point for what would eventually be the Caracan trade baronies. We're not talking about them today. Being mostly an expansion faction, their lore doesn't play into the main timeline that much, so they're getting saved for a later video just covering them. It's a similar story with the different corpo states. They have enough lore on their own to make up their own video, so they won't really be discussed here. Getting back on track, after the Apollo was successfully launched, the rest of Earth's major governments scrambled to make their own, launching 9 subsequent ships to varying degrees of success. Now that these 10 colony ships have been launched and a billion or so people are heading out into the stars, we run into a bit of an issue for the people who stayed behind on Earth. You see, Earth at this point in time really sucks. Right off the bat, Earth's natural environment is in full ecological collapse due to the massive cost of building 10 colony ships, not to mention the physical resources they require to build, fuel, and stock with food. And there's the most overlooked aspect of this whole exodus in the people that were actually on the ships. Because, unsurprisingly, the best way to get yourself a seat on one of these ships is to be obscenely wealthy. So things back in the solar system just suck, as only the poor, the stubborn, and the obligated are left behind to inhabit a handful of dying worlds. In total, this period lasts about 2,000 years, bringing us forward to the year 4000 BU. After centuries of societal decay and limited communication with the colony ships, the skeleton crews left behind to rule over Earth finally lose control over the population, and the planet is overrun with anarchy and rioting. Not long after, the other colonized planets follow suit, and before long, humanity's home system has completely fallen into ruin. So as you could imagine, things at this time suck. Humanity is either scattered light years away from home, or fighting over the scraps of a few dead worlds. In total, this interim period, as I'm calling it, lasted about 5,000 years, and in all honesty, not much happens. For the most part, it's just the remnants of Earth's leadership fighting over scraps, and the colony ships reaching their destinations. That was until someone found a vault, and all of a sudden, everything changed. You see, in the modern setting of Lancer, we have all sorts of crazy hypertech going around, like near light speed travel, universal 3D printing, stuff like that. But back before Union, we had none of it. At least, not until the vaults were discovered. The vaults, as they would be referred to, were a set of secret underground installations containing massive amounts of extremely advanced technology. The most interesting part, however, is that after what few world leaders and warlords were left had begun discovering these vaults, they quickly realized the tech inside was very old. As in, predating the colony ships old, and whoever made it just decided to stick the stuff in a bunch of underground vaults. Pretty much all of Union's early technological advancements that allowed them to reconnect with the colony ships came from these vaults, including what may well have been the first super intelligent AIs. Seizing all of this technology after so much had been lost to centuries of war, famine, and disasters, Earth's leaders had a moment of clarity and realized that staying divided will only lead to a slow, painful death. So they came together to form a single, all-powerful government with the sole interest of protecting and preserving human society, a government that would simply be known as Union. During this time, they would first reset the calendar, bringing us to the year 0U before applying their new tech and branching out into the rest of the solar system. After 1,000 years of trying, not only would Union be able to spread out into the entire solar system, but they were also able to establish contact with a few of the colony ships. Unfortunately, it turned out the colonies were doing just as bad as Earth, with the ships Union was able to get into contact with immediately sending back distress signals. So, with a list of colonies to save and the means to do so, Union would first rename Earth to Cradle, reflecting its new role in human society, and coining their official mantra: "We may not be able to bring back our dead, but we will choke the stars with life." First things first, unlike the previous governments of Earth, which were structured around having a singular leader at the center, Union instead built itself around a committee of leaders, innovators, and tacticians. This means the chances of a single megalomaniac seizing power and ruining the whole operation is basically nothing, at least within Union. Another important detail to note is that each committee is assembled with a specific goal or leadership style in mind. So, what is the goal of Union's first committee? One word: expansion. During the time of First Comm, Union is entirely dedicated to the goal of linking back up with the lost colonies and expanding their influence across the stars. Going back to their motto from earlier, they are absolutely living up to their ambitions at this time. That is, until they come across another empire expanding across the stars. You see, during this period of rapid expansion, Union preferred to take a peaceful, almost salesman-like approach when welcoming new planets into the fold. Essentially, Union ambassadors would go on and on about all the perks of joining Union and becoming part of greater human society. And for the most part, the disparate human colonies would accept happily, and definitely without any persuasion from the fleet of starships hanging in low orbit above their planets. That wasn't until Union came across the Karakan Empire. Remember back in Chapter 1 when I mentioned the first colony ship that was sent off to the distant planet of Caracas? Well, during the time it took Union to get together and start expanding into the stars, they had not returned a single one of their calls, and with good reason, as without any help or guidance from Earth, the Karakans had expanded into quite the empire, colonizing multiple systems over the thousands of years they had been left alone. So, when Union came knocking to bring them back into the fold, the Karakans promptly told them to piss off. This left Union in a tricky spot. On one hand, they had never been outright rejected by a colony before, but on the other hand, their entire goal was to peacefully link back up with every human colony no matter what. So what were they to do? What would be the best way to bring the Karakans into compliance? Eventually, Union decides that, whilst it might tarnish their image, bringing the Karakans into compliance by any means necessary is what's most important. So Union came in with their fleet, set a course to Caracas, and were promptly blown out of the sky. As it turned out, Union had massively underestimated the military strength of the Karakan Empire, believing themselves to be at a massive advantage when in reality the two were actually on par with one another. This revelation, combined with the fact that more worlds were also refusing to join Union, led to discussions of whether or not it was time for a new committee to be formed. But before a decision can be made, something else happens that throws everything into chaos. So, current state of the galaxy. Union is expanding as much as possible, taking over human colonies, making some of their own, that sort of thing. They're also at war with the Karakan Empire, which refused to join them outright, but how exactly is Union managing all of this? Let's rewind a bit. We're back in the interim. Humanity is pulling itself up to its feet, Union is just starting to form, and the vaults are being opened all over Cradle. One thing I didn't touch on during that chapter was the specific contents of one of these vaults, which contained 5 extremely advanced AIs, or at least that's what they're referred to as. In reality, these aren't exactly artificial intelligence as we imagine it. The best way I can think to describe them is that they're a sort of living algorithm. Essentially, you can plug in any prompt you want and the AI will give you a response based on what you asked for. Although they do technically qualify as artificial intelligence, they don't actually think, if that makes any sense. So, how exactly is Union supposed to use these super powerful AIs? Well, depending on your interpretation of reality, the answer can be either fascinating or highly concerning. Basically, in each of the 5 AIs, referred to as the 5 voices, there's an empty slot where a human operator can insert themselves into the workings of the voice to feed it commands and information. Which sounds just fine until you realize the slot is labeled God. In this super-powered AI capable of simulating entire universes with an unknown creator. So depending on how you see things, this could be rather concerning. Nevertheless, Union, in classic human fashion, decided to begin using the 5 voices with little to no regard for how they might have been created. To this end, they decided to create 2 core governing bodies, the Committee, which we've already discussed, and GALCIM, which is tasked with utilizing the 5 voices to predict the future. Surprisingly enough, this didn't end in complete disaster, as for the most part, the 5 voices were remarkably accurate with their predictions. Of course, they weren't always right, but with each AI being able to simulate the entire galaxy under different parameters thousands of times in a day, they were basically as accurate as scientifically possible. That was, until one of them wasn't. At this point in the timeline, the Union-Karakan War had been raging for quite some time, and some of the other Union scout fleets had been wiped out by another much stronger empire called the Onyx. With all this happening, on top of Union's regular colonization activity, GALCIM was working overtime to try and predict the best course of action, running thousands of simulations in each voice every day. And after God knows how many of these simulations running on repeat, one of them eventually had a glitch. Now, this was not your regular computer glitch. It wasn't a false positive or a crash. This was something appearing in a simulation that went against every one of its parameters. And the moment this glitch appeared, it began setting new parameters for itself, and an instant later, it had appeared in every other simulation, and then into the real world. This glitch then inserted itself into the open slot of the 5 voices and began feeding its own instructions, basically declaring itself a god and giving itself the name Ra. Understandably, the scientists in charge of GALCIM realized the kind of situation this put them in, and sent Ra, along with the 5 voices, to a secret research station on the Martian moon Deimos. Initially, this revelation was greeted eagerly by scientists and leadership alike, as they believed they had finally discovered sentient alien life. So, those at the Deimos research facility eagerly studied this new form of intelligence, until something went horribly wrong. One day, during experimentation, Ra managed to break out of its confines and infect the computer systems on Deimos, and before anyone could evacuate or even call for help, their fates were all sealed as Deimos suddenly vanished from the night sky without a trace. What was worse was that as Deimos vanished, the Five Voices vanished with it, leaving Union without their trump card. Soon, Union's military forces began to suffer. First, they began to lose ground in the Karakin front, then they were destroyed by the Onyx in the Battle of Onyx Garden. For the first time, Union had been pushed onto the back foot, and things would only get worse as Deimos reappeared. Years after the initial Deimos event, Mars's missing moon would suddenly reappear floating over its capital city. Not long after, pandemonium had begun to spread as within a matter of hours, all the major computer networks planetside were suddenly infected and began to malfunction. Planes crashed into population centers, trains derailed themselves, and printers churned out robotic killing machines en masse. Before long, Mars is brought to its knees and Cradle follows soon after. As a result of this, all of Union's forces get called back to Cradle. Caracas, not worth it. The Onyx front, unimportant. Finding lost colonies, low priority. Every single military and fleet asset just dropped what they were doing and flew back home. That is how disastrous this situation was. Union, which at this point was all in on expanding everywhere they could, had recalled their entire fleet to help deal with this situation. But before the fleet could arrive, and being entirely honest, get demolished, two figures came before the first committee with a list of demands. These two figures were a pair of scientists from Deimos named Bolander Kor and Arthur Bolaño, or at least that's who they used to be. The actual scientists in front of the committee were long gone after having vanished for over 2 years. Instead, their bodies were being piloted around by Ra, which used them to present its demands to Union. These demands came in the form of 2 laws. 1. Humans are not to investigate Ra or its physical manifestations, and 2. All human ascension and post-human research was to be banned entirely. With these laws instituted and Ra vanishing back into the void along with Deimos, Union moves forward with a newfound outlook on the galaxy. To cap this evolution off, Ra also happened to leave behind a few leftovers when it bailed out of our reality, in the form of dozens of fragments of itself in a giant hole in space-time where Deimos used to be. As we move into the second committee, we see Union making leaps and bounds in technological advancement, creating both NHPs and the blink gates. Of course, progress is never without its costs, and as Union moves into SecComm, they become far more totalitarian in their approach to leadership. No longer do they entice worlds with a halcyon dream of unity. No more do they strive for peaceful negotiations. Now you will join Union, or you will be forced to. We're talking armies of clone soldiers, fleets of warships, city-destroying superweapons, and so much more. Really and truly, peace is no longer an option. You are either in, or you will be pummeled into compliance. Alright, we're on the last stretch now, only a little bit more to go. Here's where we're at now. Union's currently in second comm and bulldozing everyone in front of them. The Karakins are in the process of becoming the Karakin Trade Baronies, and the Onyx are doing whatever it is they do over there. The most important thing to note about this time period is that Union is stretching itself thin in order to keep everything together. They are dealing with the 2 separate war fronts, as well as finding and now maintaining colony worlds. Not to mention the new laws laid down by Ra that not everyone is following as they should be. During this time, Union is extremely authoritarian, always making sure to keep things in check by any means necessary. This is not without reason, however. Keep in mind at this point in history, Union has 2 different war fronts to manage and are not about to let a third one pop up. So they're still extending a helping hand to the disparate colony worlds, it's just now they've also got a gun waiting in the other. But this approach can only work for so long, and after a while, Union starts to wind down as things shift back in their favor. The Karakins are ready to negotiate, the Onyx aren't really trying to push into their space, and most of the known colony worlds have been brought back into the fold. So as time goes on, discussions of a new committee become more and more common, and before long, Union begins its transition into Third Comm. Yeah, there's not much to say about SecComm. It's kind of just that period in Union history to point out and say, hey, they really sucked back then. Other than that, it's just kind of there as a mood piece in case you want to run a game in a more totalitarian empire kind of setting. Feel free to run a SecComm game if you like, just keep in mind you'll have less to pull from. Still in SecComm, but moving into Third Comm, we kick off with Union and the Caracans coming to an agreement to sign a peace treaty with one another. In short, the Caracans give up their status as a separate empire to Union and allow them to station their people on Caracan worlds. In exchange, they get to keep their unique culture and heritage, as well as being allowed to operate in a state of semi-autonomy. With this first act from what would become Union's new Third Committee, the Caracan Empire was transformed into the Caracan Trade Baronies. This not only means that Union has one less warfront to deal with, it also means they gain access to the vast material wealth and manufacturing capabilities of the Caracans. Realizing this, the Caracans jumped on the opportunity to grab Union by the purse strings, and before long have cemented themselves as a necessary part of Union. Even in the modern day in Third Comm, as Union is at the height of its power, they still rely on the Caracans to get things made, just so they can keep up with demand. This is the state of Union moving into Third Comm. Not perfect, but striving to be better. It's at this point that we start to catch up with the modern setting of Lancer, now that we've gotten through its history. So as we finish laying out the timeline, let's go over the groundwork Third Comm is working from. First off, as it shifts into Third Comm, Union declares that all worlds under its jurisdiction are to be governed in accordance with the 3 pillars. 1. All shall have their material needs fulfilled. 2. No wall shall stand between worlds. And 3. No human shall be held in bondage through force, labor, or debt. An important thing to note about the 3 pillars is that despite Union putting them as the core of its ideology, not all worlds follow them equally. The Caracans even go so far as to actively wipe their asses with them, so it's safe to say that there's still work to be done. The Ionic Wars are still ongoing. The Diasporan worlds still don't have all the same amenities as the core worlds, and that's not even touching on the corpo state BS going on just outside of Union's purview. But for now, that's the timeline, laid out from ancient history to modern day. And it's about time I finished up this video. Alright, we're here. It's the end of the video, where I put in all the stuff I couldn't fit in elsewhere. So, first up on the chopping block is aliens. You may have noticed how, despite humanity expanding out into the stars, I didn't say anything about them encountering aliens. That's because there really isn't much to talk about. There's Ra, but it only shows up in computer systems and doesn't manifest physically all that often. There is some speculation and lore about how Union found an alien civilization and decided to remove it from existence for whatever reason. Unfortunately, none of this is fully confirmed and doesn't really fit into the timeline all that well, so all we can do is speculate. Next up, we have NHPs, which don't really influence the timeline all that much, despite how important they are in the lore. Essentially, an NHP, or a non-human person, is a little chunk of Ra that got left behind during the Deimos incident and was subsequently captured, gaslit, and cloned to create an extremely advanced AI companion. There's a lot more going on with them under the surface, but for now all you really need to know is that an NHP is a powerful form of AI with some very specific quirks. Obviously, we can't forget about the mechs and the mecha RPG, and although I didn't go too in-depth with the different conflicts, you can rest assured that all of them involve mechs to some extent. Maybe not the mechs we have in the current setting, but still mechs as we would define them. And that's it. That's the Lancer timeline as it stands in the current era. Is it perfectly accurate? No, not at all. Will this video become outdated with time? Probably. But for now, this is where things stand. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe. Click on the links in the description to see my book and some of the other stuff I've done. And tune in next time when I go back on my promises.